Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel backward through an immense span of time, backward through highways and cities, backward through villages and harvests, backward through cave paintings and stone tools, backward through bone and ash and footprints pressed into ancient ground, backward through hundreds of thousands of years, and then through millions of years more, into the long, slow story of how human beings came to exist. The story does not begin with people. It begins with ancestors that did not yet look human. Small creatures moving quietly through ancient African forests, tree branches above them, soft soil below, distant sunlight filtering through enormous green leaves. The world they inhabited was warmer in places, cooler in others, shifting endlessly across millions of years of climate change. Continents drifted slowly, forests expanded and contracted, grasslands opened and closed, and through all of it, a long chain of living creatures continued breathing, eating, sleeping, and passing their genes onward, generation after generation. Modern human beings share an extraordinary amount of biological material with other primates. With chimpanzees, we share roughly 98.7% of our DNA. With bonobos, nearly the same. With gorillas, slightly less. With orangutans, less still. All primates trace their ancestry back through tens of millions of years of shared history. The branches of that family tree spread outward across deep time, and somewhere on one quiet branch, our own ancestors began to diverge from those who became modern chimpanzees and bonobos. That divergence occurred roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, somewhere in Africa, probably in forests or woodlands that no longer exist in the same form. We do not know the exact place. We do not know the exact common ancestor, but genetic evidence and fossil evidence together suggest the split happened gradually, across many generations, in landscapes long since transformed by erosion, climate, and the patient movement of geological time. One of the earliest known fossils possibly connected to the human line is called Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its remains were uncovered in the deserts of Chad. In Central Africa, the skull is roughly 7 million years old. The face is small. The brain is only slightly larger than that of a modern chimpanzee. But something about the angle at which the skull would have sat. Upon the spine suggested to researchers that this creature may have walked upright at least some of the time. A possibility, not a certainty, a whisper from across an enormous distance of time. A little later in the fossil record came Orrorin tuganensis, found in the Tugan Hills of Kenya, approximately 6 million years old. Fragments of thigh bone hinted at the possibility of upright walking. These earliest possible ancestors were not yet recognizably human. They were experiments, branches in a thick evolutionary bush, most of which would eventually wither away, leaving only a few quiet lines continuing forward. Later still, around 4.4 million years ago, lived a creature known as Ardipithecus ramidus, discovered in Ethiopia. Its skeleton was unusual. It seemed to live partly in trees and partly on the ground. Its feet still had grasping toes useful for climbing. Yet its pelvis showed features consistent with walking upright. It was neither a chimpanzee nor a person. It was something between worlds, a creature suited to a landscape of forests and open clearings, moving between them across the rhythm of seasons. And then, deeper into the human story, came the group of ancestors known collectively as the Australopithecines. They lived across Africa for several million years. Different species, different regions, different adaptations. Together, they formed a long, varied, complicated chapter in the story of becoming human. The most famous of these Australopithecines is a small skeleton from Ethiopia, known as Lucy. She lived roughly 3.2 million years ago. She was discovered in 1974 by paleoanthropologists working in the Afar region. They named her Lucy because the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing at their camp on the evening of her discovery. She stood only about 3.5 feet tall. Her bones revealed something extraordinary. She walked upright. Her pelvis was shaped for bipedalism. Her knees angled inward beneath her body, the way a modern human's knees do. And yet her brain was small, about the size of a chimpanzee's. She was bipedal long before her descendants were intelligent in the modern sense. This single discovery transformed thinking about human evolution because, for a long time, scholars had imagined that large brains came first and walking upright came afterward. Lucy reversed that assumption. Walking upright came first. The large brain came much later. The earliest steps of our story were taken on feet, not in thought. Even older, than Lucy are a set of footprints preserved in volcanic ash at a site called Laetoli in what is now Tanzania. They are roughly 3.6 million years old. 2 or 3 small individuals walked across soft volcanic ash one ancient day. Rain may have fallen shortly afterward, hardening the ash. More volcanic ash later sealed the prints beneath protective layers. They remained hidden for over 3.5 million years. When researchers finally uncovered them, the footprints showed a striding bipedal gait. Heel strike, arched foot, toes pushing off forward. The same essential mechanics of human walking still used today. Other Australopithecines lived across Africa during this long stretch of time. There was Australopithecus africanus, known from the Taung child skull found in South Africa in 1924. There was Australopithecus sediba, more recently discovered in the cradle of humankind, also in South Africa. There were robust species, sometimes placed in a separate genus called Paranthropus, with enormous jaws and massive grinding teeth adapted for chewing tough plant material. Some of these species coexisted with each other. Different shapes, different diets, different strategies for survival. None of them were yet the species we now call human. They were all part of a wider family, all related, all sharing the same general world. Walking upright reshaped the human body across these long stretches of time. The pelvis became shorter and bowl-shaped, supporting the weight of the body above. The spine developed gentle curves to keep the head balanced over the hips. The opening at the base of the skull, called the foramen magnum, moved forward so the skull could sit on top of the spine rather than hanging from the front of it. The feet lost their grasping ability and developed arches. The big toe aligned with the others. The legs grew longer. The arms grew relatively shorter. The whole skeleton was reorganized to make standing and walking efficient. This reorganization was not free. There were costs. The narrowed pelvis made giving birth more difficult because the birth canal also had to remain narrow enough for efficient walking, while still wide enough for an infant skull to pass through. Over evolutionary time, this tension never fully resolved. Human childbirth remains slow, difficult, and often dangerous in ways unusual among mammals. Infants are born early relative to their adult brain size, helpless, dependent on caregivers for years. The long human childhood is partly a consequence of this ancient trade-off between walking upright and growing a large brain. And yet, the advantages of bipedalism were profound. Walking upright frees the hands, hands free to carry food across distances, hands free to carry infants, hands free to gather, to throw, to make, hands free to eventually shape stone, weave fiber, light fires, paint walls. Walking upright also exposed less of the body to direct overhead sun, which may have helped early ancestors stay cooler on hot African savannas. And it raised the eyes higher above grasses, allowing creatures to see predators or food sources at greater distances. Each of these small advantages, accumulated across countless generations, helped shape the lineage that would eventually become ours. The earliest known stone tools are even older than the genus Homo itself. At a site in Kenya called Lomekwi, researchers have found stone artifacts dating back roughly 3.3 million years. Simple, crude, but unmistakably shaped by intentional striking. These tools predate the first true humans by several 100,000 years. They suggest that tool making, at least in its earliest forms, was not invented by humans. It was inherited by them. By around 2.6 million years ago, a more recognizable tool-making tradition had emerged. It is called the Oldowan, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where many examples have been found. Oldowan tools were made by striking one stone against another to produce sharp flakes. The flakes could be used to cut meat from bones, to slice plant material, to scrape hides. The cores left behind also became tools in their own right. Simple, functional, effective enough that this technology persisted across vast stretches of time, around 2.4 million years ago, perhaps a little earlier. The first members of the genus Homo began to appear in the fossil record. The earliest is often called Homo habilis, meaning handy man, because its remains were associated with stone tools. Its brain was larger than that of the Australopithecines, roughly 600 cubic centimeters on average, still less than half the size of a modern human brain, but a significant step. And the body was still small, still partly adapted for climbing, still very different from the proportions of modern humans. Whether Homo habilis truly belongs in the genus Homo at all remains debated. Some researchers consider it transitional. Some consider it a late Australopithecine. The boundaries between species in deep time are rarely clean. Species blend into each other across thousands of generations. Names are imposed retroactively on populations that did not yet know they were becoming something different. What matters more than the names is the pattern of slow expansion, the pattern of brains growing larger, tools growing more refined, behaviors growing more complex. Around 1.9 million years ago, a new species emerged that would mark a major turning point. Homo erectus. Tall, long-legged, with a body more similar to a modern human's than any earlier species. Brain size in early erectus averaged around 800 cubic centimeters. Later, populations approached 1,000. Homo erectus is the first member of our lineage known to have walked out of Africa. Its remains have been found in Georgia, in the Caucasus, in China, in Indonesia, in regions across enormous stretches of Eurasia. The site at Dmanisi in Georgia preserves remarkable skulls from nearly 1.8 million years ago. Already, by that time, the long human migration had begun. Homo erectus carried with it a refined form of stone tool, the Acheulean hand axe, symmetrical, almond-shaped, worked carefully on both faces to produce a balanced cutting edge. These tools persisted for over 1 million years across vast geographic regions, with relatively little change. They suggest a kind of mental template, a shared idea of what a tool should look like, transmitted from generation to generation across enormous spans of time. Somewhere during this long era, control of fire entered human life. The exact moment is uncertain. There is some evidence of burned bones and ash at sites in Africa nearly 1.5 million years old, possibly more. There are stronger signs of regular fire use by perhaps 1 million years ago. At sites such as Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, by several 100,000 years ago. Hearths and burned wood are common at human sites. Fire transformed everything. It allowed warmth in cold climates. It frightened away predators at night. It extended the day. It gathered communities into circles of light. And it allowed cooking. Cooking changed the human body itself. Cooked food is easier to chew, easier to digest. It releases more calories per bite. The teeth and jaws of human ancestors gradually grew smaller. Across the generations as cooking spread, the gut shrank. Energy that had previously been spent on digestion became available for other purposes, One influential idea, sometimes called the expensive tissue hypothesis, suggests that this freed energy helped support the growth of a larger, more demanding brain. The brain is metabolically costly. It consumes about 20% of a resting human's energy budget. Cooking may have been one of the gifts that made such a brain possible. Walking long distances also shaped the human body. Compared to most mammals, humans are not particularly fast, but humans can run for very long periods of time without overheating. We sweat across most of our body surface through millions of eccrine sweat glands. We have lost most of our body hair, allowing heat to escape more efficiently. Our long legs, springy tendons, and stable cores let us cover great distances at moderate speeds. Some researchers have proposed that endurance running played an important role in the evolution of the human form, perhaps in pursuit of prey across hot savannas until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. Whether or not endurance hunting was a central force, the anatomy suggests that long-distance movement mattered. Alongside these changes in body, changes in the brain and behavior continued, slowly accumulating. Skull anatomy shifted to accommodate larger frontal regions. The vocal tract gradually changed, with the larynx descending lower in the throat. This descent improved the range of sounds that could be produced, but introduced a new risk. Food and air now shared a path more closely than in most mammals, making choking possible. The ability to speak came partly at the cost of safety while eating. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat, shows changes across hominin fossils suggesting that the anatomical capacity for complex speech developed gradually across hundreds of thousands of years. A gene called OXP2, which affects the development of speech and language in modern humans, shows evolutionary changes that may have contributed to the human ability to articulate spoken language. After Homo erectus, the fossil record shows further transitional species. Homo heidelbergensis is one common name applied to populations living roughly 700,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa and Europe. These populations had larger brains than erectus, more refined tools, and may have been the common ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans. The site of Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, sometimes called the Pit of Bones, preserves the remains of dozens of individuals deposited deep inside a cave system, perhaps deliberately, perhaps washed in by water hundreds of thousands of years ago. The fossils are remarkable. They reveal a community of beings who looked already partly Neanderthal-like, suggesting that the Neanderthal lineage was deep, ancient, and slowly developing alongside other human lines. The Neanderthals themselves lived across Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia from roughly 400,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago. They were not the brutish stereotypes once imagined. Their brains were on average slightly larger than those of modern humans. Their bodies were stockier, shorter limbed, well adapted to cold climates. They hunted large game, including mammoths, bison, woolly rhinoceroses, and reindeer. They made sophisticated stone tools, including the careful, prepared core flake technique known as levallois. They controlled fire. They wore clothing of some kind, almost certainly. They buried at least some of their dead. They cared for the elderly and the injured. One Neanderthal skeleton from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq lived to an advanced age despite serious injuries. That would have left him dependent on others for survival. Whether or not flowers were truly placed beside another individual at Shanidar, as one famous interpretation once suggested, remains debated. But the basic picture of Neanderthals as social, capable, deeply human in many essential ways has only grown stronger as evidence has accumulated. Many Neanderthals likely had pale skin, and some carried genetic variants associated with red hair. They were our cousins, separated from us by perhaps 500,000 years of independent evolution, yet close enough that when our ancestors eventually met them, our species could and did interbreed. A second related group came to light in 2010 when researchers analyzing DNA from a small finger bone fragment found at Denisova Cave in Siberia discovered that it belonged to a previously unknown human population. They named the group Denisovans, after the cave. Almost no fossils of Denisovans have been found beyond a few teeth, fragments of bone, and a partial jaw later discovered in Tibet. Yet, their DNA tells a long story. Denisovans lived across parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were related to Neanderthals, but distinct. They interbred with our ancestors as well. Modern populations in parts of Asia, Oceania, and especially among certain groups in Papua New Guinea and Australia carry several % Denisovan ancestry, in some cases as much as 4 to 6%. One particularly remarkable inheritance from Denisovans helps modern Tibetans live at high altitudes, with relatively little stress on the body. A version of a gene called EPAS1, which influences how the body manages oxygen, appears to have been inherited from Denisovan ancestors who once lived on or near the Tibetan plateau. Across the silent passing of time, a small genetic gift from an ancient cousin still helps people breathe more easily today on some of the highest inhabited landscapes on Earth. Other human species also lived during recent stretches of time. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, a small species called Homo floresiensis lived until perhaps 50,000 years ago. They stood only about 3.5 feet tall and had brains roughly the size of grapefruits. Yet they made stone tools and hunted local fauna. They have been nicknamed hobbits because of their small size. In the Philippines, on the island of Luzon, fossils of a different small-bodied species called Homo luzonensis have been described. In South Africa, deep within a complex cave system, remains of a species called Homo naledi have been found in conditions that suggest the bodies may have been deliberately placed there. Homo naledi is particularly remarkable. The bones were discovered deep within a difficult cave system in the cradle of humankind, in a chamber called the Rising Star. To reach the chamber, modern researchers had to crawl through a passage so narrow that only the smallest cavers could fit through. Yet many individuals of this small-brained species had somehow ended up in that nearly inaccessible space. Dating placed the fossils at roughly 250,000 to 350,000 years ago, far more recent than the small brains and primitive features of the skeletons might initially suggest. They may have coexisted with the very earliest members of our own species. Whether the bodies were deliberately placed in the cave, swept in by water, or arrived in some other way is still debated. The chamber holds its secrets quietly. Other notable fossils continue to reshape the human family tree. From Heilongjiang province in northeastern China comes a large skull, sometimes called Dragon Man, with a tentative species name of Homo longi, which may belong to a population closely related to the Denisovans. From a quarry in Germany came the Schöningen spears, a set of carefully crafted wooden hunting spears more than 300,000 years old, preserved by waterlogged soil. They are the oldest complete wooden hunting weapons known, and their balance and design suggest skilled production by Homo heidelbergensis, or an early Neanderthal population. From the Atapuerca complex in Spain came not only the bones of Cima de los Huesos, but also fossils of even older populations, some classified as Homo antecessor, possibly close to one of the very earliest entries of humans into Europe. From Mislia Cave in Israel comes a jaw that may represent an early Homo sapiens presence in the Levant nearly 200,000 years ago. From Apodima Cave in Greece comes a partial skull that may extend the earliest known sapiens presence outside Africa to more than 200,000 years ago. Although interpretation remains debated, each new fossil softens older assumptions. The story of human becoming was never a tidy ladder. It was a wide, tangled bush with branches reaching outward, mingling, drying away, sprouting again, mingling once more. The picture that has emerged from these discoveries is striking. For most of human history, our species was not alone. Multiple human species coexisted on Earth, sometimes overlapping in time, sometimes in space, sharing landscapes, perhaps occasionally meeting at the edges of their territories. Homo sapiens itself, our own species, emerged roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. The earliest known fossils that may be assigned to our species come from Jebel Irhoud, a site in Morocco, dated to around 300,000 years ago. These early sapiens had faces that already looked broadly modern, though their skulls retained some archaic features. Later, remains from Omo Kibish and Herto in Ethiopia, dated to around 195,000 and 160,000 years ago, respectively, show forms even closer to modern human anatomy. It is important to remember that human evolution did not occur in a single straight line, marching toward us. It was a tangle. Many populations across Africa likely contributed to what eventually became Homo sapiens. There was no single Eden. There was no single first family. Genetic and fossil evidence suggests that early modern humans existed across multiple regions of Africa and mixed with each other over very long stretches of time, gradually producing the patterns we observe today. Within that ancient African tapestry, all modern humans share certain very deep ancestors. Through mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through the maternal line, scientists can trace back to a single woman who lived in Africa perhaps 150 to 200,000 years ago. She is sometimes called mitochondrial Eve. She was not the only woman alive at her time. She was simply the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all currently living humans. Similarly, through the Y chromosome, which is inherited only through the paternal line, all living men share a most recent common ancestor, sometimes called Y chromosome Adam. These figures did not know each other. They likely did not even live at the same time. They are statistical points in a vast field of ancestry, but they remind us that all living humans share threads of inheritance reaching back into a common past. There were earlier movements of Homo sapiens out of Africa as well. Fossils from caves in modern Israel, such as Skul and Kafse, suggest that anatomically modern humans had reached the eastern Mediterranean by around 120,000 years ago. Some of these populations may have died out. Some may have retreated when climates shifted. The major migration that eventually populated most of the world is usually placed at around 70,000 years ago, plus or minus, when bands of sapiens carrying African genetic heritage began moving steadily across the Sinai and into the wider continents. It was during these migrations that our ancestors began to encounter Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other archaic populations. They did not always pass each other by. They sometimes mated. Sometimes the children of these unions had children of their own. As a result, almost every living person whose ancestry traces partly outside of Africa carries roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome today. Some populations carry similar or greater percentages of Denisovan DNA. The boundaries between species in those long-gone centuries were porous. The story we now tell about ourselves is partly written in inheritance from those cousins, even though they themselves have long since vanished as separate populations. The last Neanderthals are generally thought to have disappeared around 40,000 years ago, possibly slightly later in certain refuges. The reasons for their disappearance are still debated. Climate change, competition with modern humans, absorption through interbreeding, disease, some combination of all of these. By around 40,000 years ago, in much of Eurasia, Homo sapiens had become the only remaining human species across enormous stretches of the world. The Ice Age world that these populations moved across was very different from the world we know today. For long stretches of time, much of northern Europe and Asia lay buried beneath thick ice sheets. Sea levels were much lower, exposing land that today rests under hundreds of feet of ocean. A vast cold grassland called the Mammoth Steppe stretched across much of northern Eurasia and into Alaska. It was a strange ecosystem, productive in short summers, frozen in long winters, home to enormous herbivores and the predators that hunted them. Mammoths walked through these landscapes in slow herds. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed alongside them. Bison wandered across cold valleys. Cave bears slept in the dark hollows of European limestone caves. Cave lions hunted across open ground. Saber-toothed cats lived in some regions. Giant deer with antlers spanning more than 2.5 meters in some cases picked their way through forest edges, and in the long, cold dark, modern humans, Neanderthals, and other archaic populations all hunted, gathered, and survived as best they could. To live in such environments, humans developed warm clothing made from hides. The earliest evidence is indirect, drawn from genetic studies of human body lice, which suggest that humans began wearing clothing as a regular practice tens of thousands of years, before any clothing itself was preserved. Eyed needles made from bone and ivory appear in the archaeological record by around 40 to 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier, suggesting tailored clothing made from carefully prepared and sewn hides. Such garments would have been essential for survival across northern winters. Stone tool technology continued to evolve. Earlier than once thought, our ancestors developed projectile weapons, spear throwers, sometimes called atlatls, gave hunters greatly increased range and force. The bow and arrow may have emerged in southern Africa more than 60,000 years ago, where small stone points and other indirect evidence suggest its early use. Microliths, tiny, precisely shaped stone pieces hafted into wooden or bone shafts, became increasingly important in later periods, used as arrow points, knife edges, and components of composite tools. Bone harpoons with carefully carved barbs appeared at African sites such as Katanda more than 90,000 years ago. Used most likely for spearing fish, coastal living also became important in many regions. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, evidence suggests that early modern humans were gathering and cooking shellfish more than 160,000 years ago. This use of marine resources may have been an important strategy during difficult climate periods, when inland food was scarce. Along coastlines, tides offered a renewable bounty of mussels, clams, oysters, and other shellfish that could be harvested across the generations. diving for shellfish and gathering across exposed tidal zones may have been some of the earliest forms of stable food collection by our species. Other foods left subtler traces. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that accumulates on teeth, sometimes preserves fragments of starch grains, plant fibers, and even bacterial DNA from the lifetimes of ancient individuals. From these microscopic remains, researchers have learned that ancient peoples ate a far broader range of plants, including grains and tubers, than was once recognized. Some Neanderthals appear to have used medicinal plants. Their oral microbiomes preserve signatures of diet and disease. Even cooked starches have been identified, suggesting that techniques for preparing starchy roots and tubers reach very deep into the human past. The ability to read this kind of ancient evidence has been transformed in recent decades by advances in ancient DNA technology. Until relatively recently, DNA was thought to break down too quickly to be recovered from bones older than a few thousand years. But careful work in clean laboratories, combined with rapidly improving sequencing methods, has changed everything. In 2010, the first Neanderthal genome was successfully sequenced, opening a window onto our cousins that had been closed for tens of thousands of years. The Swedish biologist Svante Pääbo, who led much of this work, eventually received the Nobel Prize for the achievement. Soon afterward, the first Denisovan genome followed, derived from a single tiny finger bone. Older DNA has since been recovered from increasingly ancient fossils. The bones from the Cima de los Huesos pit in Spain have yielded genetic material reaching back several 100,000 years, making them among the oldest hominin DNA ever sequenced. Mitochondrial DNA, which exists in many copies per cell and is easier to recover than nuclear DNA, has been pulled from samples even older than that. With each new study, the picture of human evolution becomes more complex and more interesting. Populations once thought to have been completely separate turn out to have exchanged genes. Lines once thought to be entirely extinct turn out to live on within the genomes of modern people. The story keeps deepening, layer upon layer. Ancient DNA has also revealed that the genetic diversity within Africa is far greater than the diversity outside it. Every non-African population alive today descends from a relatively small group of African ancestors who passed through a long bottleneck during the major out-of-Africa migration. Populations that remained in Africa by contrast, never went through that particular bottleneck. As a result, two individuals from different African regions can sometimes be more genetically different from each other than two individuals from distant continents outside Africa. The Khoisan-speaking peoples of southern Africa, for instance, carry some of the deepest lineages within our species, having diverged from other African populations long before any of the major migrations into Eurasia, within Eurasia. In the wake of the major out-of-Africa expansion, populations continued to mix, split, and migrate over many tens of thousands of years. Ice ages reshaped the geography. Forests retreated and returned. Whole landscapes that today lie beneath shallow seas were once dry land, where bands of hunters and gatherers lived their lives. The North Sea, between Britain and continental Europe, was once a region of rivers, marshes, and woodlands, sometimes called Doggerland by archaeologists. People lived there for thousands of years before rising seas. After the end of the last ice age, slowly drowned their world. Occasionally, fishing trawlers still pull up worked bone, antler tools, or stone artifacts from beneath the modern waves. The last ice age reached its coldest peak roughly 20,000 years ago. From that point onward, the great ice sheets began to melt. Sea levels rose. Coastlines moved inland. Forests advanced into regions that had been tundra. New landscapes opened. Populations responded by moving, adapting, and changing. The end of the Ice Age was not smooth. Around 12,800 years ago, a sudden cooling event known as the Younger Dryas plunged parts of the northern hemisphere back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The cause is still debated. Some researchers point to changes in ocean circulation. Others have suggested possible cosmic impacts. The event coincided with major changes among human populations. In some regions, hunting cultures that had specialized in Ice Age megafauna disappeared as their prey died out. In others, new ways of life emerged from the disruption. The Holocene, our current geological epoch, began roughly 11,700 years ago. After the Younger Dryas ended, it has been a relatively stable, warm period, far more climatically calm than the Ice Age that preceded it. This stability is one of the conditions that made agriculture possible. Predictable seasons, reliable rainfall in many regions, and stable temperature ranges all helped allow people to plant crops, with reasonable confidence that they would have time to grow before agriculture became widespread. However, there were already long-lived settlements in some regions. The Natufian people, who lived in parts of the Levant from roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, built stone houses and lived in semi-permanent villages without yet fully relying on farming. They gathered wild grains in such abundance that they could afford to remain in one place across the year. They were among the earliest known sedentary hunter-gatherers, and their villages laid some of the foundations on which later agricultural societies would build. In other regions, similar developments occurred independently. In parts of East Asia, pottery appears in the archaeological record extremely early, perhaps 20,000 years ago, at some Chinese sites. Long before agriculture, the Jomon culture of Japan produced elaborate pottery beginning more than 15,000 years ago. Pottery is heavy and fragile, generally only useful to people who do not need to carry everything with them constantly, which means it tends to appear in cultures with at least partly settled lifeways. The patterns are complex and varied across regions. Once agriculture did emerge, settlements grew. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, contains layers of human habitation reaching back more than 10,000 years, with stone walls and a remarkable tower that may be among the oldest known monumental structures. Çatalhöyük, in central Anatolia, was a densely packed Neolithic settlement of perhaps several thousand people, roughly 9,000 years ago, where houses were built so closely together that residents entered through their roofs. These early settlements were not yet cities in the later sense, but they revealed how rapidly human social structures were transforming under the new conditions of farming. Trade networks also grew during these times. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that produced unusually sharp tools and weapons, was traded across hundreds of kilometers from a small number of sources. Shells from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea ended up in inland regions, far from any coast. Copper was being worked in small amounts before the full Bronze Age began. Slowly, the world of separate small communities began to weave itself into something larger and more interconnected. And throughout these long transitions, the human body kept changing in small ways. Resistance to certain infectious diseases evolved in regions where particular pathogens were common. Adaptations to particular diets spread in regions where those diets dominated. Skin pigmentation continued its slow adjustment to local sunlight conditions. Skeletal patterns shifted gently with changes in physical workload. in dense agricultural societies where grain consumption was high and meat consumption sometimes low. Average height often decreased compared to earlier hunter-gatherer ancestors. Skeletons showed signs of new stresses associated with farming labor and concentrated village living. Evolution did not stop with agriculture. It simply continued under new conditions. Languages, too, continued to evolve. Long before agriculture, the deep prehistory of human language already extended far back into our story, though it left no direct fossils. Some studies of jaw, throat, and brain anatomy suggest that the capacity for fully modern speech was present at least by the time of Neanderthals, perhaps earlier. Today, thousands of distinct languages are spoken across the world. Many language families show patterns of relationships consistent with the broad outlines of population history known from genetics and archaeology. The Indo-European family alone, spoken from Western Europe to northern India, traces back through complex migrations that began thousands of years ago, with roots possibly in the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. This was also the time when symbolic culture exploded into greater visibility in the archaeological record. Long before 40,000 years ago, there were already signs of symbolic thinking at Blombos Cave in South Africa. Perforated shell beads have been found dated to roughly 75,000 years ago. Engraved ochre pieces from the same site go even further back, perhaps 100,000 years ago. These objects suggest that early modern humans were already decorating themselves, marking surfaces, perhaps assigning meaning to small portable objects. By around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, the cultural evidence becomes spectacular. In cave systems across Europe and Southeast Asia, painters were creating images of animals on stone walls. At Chauvet Cave in France, lions, horses, rhinoceroses, and mammoths were rendered with extraordinary skill in charcoal and ochre over 36,000 years ago. At sites in Indonesia, on the island of Sulawesi, a painting of a wild pig has been dated to roughly 45,500 years ago, possibly older. Hand stencils, made by blowing pigment around hands pressed against rock walls, appear at sites on multiple continents. Carved figurines also appeared in this era. The small ivory sculpture known as the Lion Man from Hohenstein-Stadel in Germany is roughly 40,000 years old. It depicts a figure with a human body and a lion's head, suggesting imaginative or perhaps spiritual thinking. Later, small, carved female figures, often called Venus figurines, appeared across Europe. The Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria, is roughly 25 to 30,000 years old. The Venus of Hohlefels, also from Germany, is older still, perhaps 40,000 years. Music too left traces. Bone flutes carved from the wing bones of vultures, and the tusks of mammoths have been found at European sites, dating to around 40,000 years ago. These instruments are precisely drilled. They produce recognizable notes. Somewhere in those ancient caves, in firelight and shadow, our ancestors played music for one another. Music, perhaps for ritual, music, perhaps for joy, music, perhaps for sleep. Burial customs also became increasingly elaborate during this long stretch of time. At Sungia, a site in modern Russia, 2 children were buried roughly 34,000 years ago, wearing clothing covered in thousands upon thousands of ivory beads. Each bead had been carved by hand from mammoth tusk. The labor required is almost difficult to imagine. Tens of thousands of hours, perhaps, gathered into a single ceremonial moment. The bodies were arranged carefully, head to head, along with carved ivory spears and other grave goods. The site speaks of a community that valued these children deeply and that possessed an artistic and social life far richer than older stereotypes of Ice Age life ever suggested. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found small figurines made of fired clay dating to around 26 to 29,000 years ago. They include a famous female figurine and many fragmented animal figurines, often broken by the heat of firing. These are among the oldest known ceramic objects in the world, predating pottery vessels by many thousands of years. The people of Dolní Věstonice were hunters of mammoths and other Ice Age animals, but they also clearly invested in art, ornament, and ritual. Cultural traditions across Europe during this era are sometimes given names based on distinctive stone, tool styles, and other features. The Aurignacian culture flourished across much of Europe from around 43,000 to 28,000 years ago. It is associated with many of the earliest cave paintings and carved figurines. The Gravettian followed, with its own distinctive technologies and its many small female figurines. The Solutrean, with its remarkable laurel leaf-shaped stone points, came afterward the Magdalenian, which followed it, produced some of the most famous cave art of all, including the great chambers of Lascaux in France, painted around 17,000 years ago. Some caves once used by these artists have since been altered by changes in sea level. The Cosca Cave in southern France, with paintings dating back perhaps 27,000 years, now has an entrance below the surface of the modern Mediterranean. To enter, divers must swim through a long underwater passage before reaching the chambers, which still rise above water level inside the cliff. Hearths from these long ago times have also been studied carefully. The careful placement of stones, the layers of charcoal, the bones discarded after meals, the small artifacts dropped during ordinary moments of daily life, all give archaeologists glimpses into the texture of ancient evenings. People sat together around firelight. They cooked food. They worked on tools. They shared stories and taught children. Sleep came to them as it comes to us. Slowly, after the long day was done, long before any of these European chapters on the other side of the world, ancestral Aboriginal Australians were already living complex symbolic and ceremonial lives. At Lake Mungo in southeastern Australia, a body sometimes called Mungo Man was buried around 42,000 years ago, sprinkled with red ochre. A nearby body, Mungo Lady, had been cremated even earlier. These burials are among the oldest known ceremonial human burials anywhere on Earth. At Majedbaby, a rock shelter in northern Australia, evidence of human occupation has been dated to roughly 65,000 years ago, with carefully ground stone tools and pigments used for painting. Ochre mining has been documented in some Australian sites going back tens of thousands of years. The arrival of humans in Australia also coincided with the disappearance of much of the continent's giant megafauna. Diprotodon, a marsupial roughly the size of a rhinoceros. Procoptodon, a giant short-faced kangaroo. Ganyornis, a large flightless bird whose eggshells, sometimes burned and scattered around old hearths, suggest direct interaction with the earliest human inhabitants. By around 45,000 years ago, much of this megafauna had vanished. Climate change played a role. Human hunting played a role. The two together changed the Australian landscape forever. Yet, Aboriginal Australian peoples have continued to live on the continent in unbroken cultural traditions ever since, carrying knowledge of the land and its history through more than 2,000 generations. Across this same long stretch of time, modern humans continued spreading across the globe. They reached Australia astonishingly early. Sites in northern Australia have been dated to around 65,000 years ago, possibly older. Reaching Australia required watercraft because even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, deep ocean channels separated parts of Indonesia from Australia. Somehow, somewhere, ancient mariners crossed open water in vessels we cannot now reconstruct. They became the ancestors of Aboriginal Australian peoples, who today carry one of the longest continuous cultural traditions known anywhere in the world. The Americas were reached later. The exact timing remains debated. For decades, the dominant view held that the first humans arrived around 13,000 years ago, associated with the Clovis culture, named after a site in New Mexico, where distinctive fluted spear points were first identified. But evidence has continued accumulating for earlier human presence. Footprints preserved in lakebed sediments at White Sands in New Mexico have been dated by some studies to around 23,000 years ago. Other sites have also pushed back the timeline. The picture remains complex, but it is increasingly clear that humans entered the Americas before the end of the last ice age, likely crossing through Beringia, the land area that once connected Siberia, and Alaska when sea levels were much lower. Beringia was not a narrow bridge. It was a wide region of cold steppe, possibly habitable for long periods, where small populations may have lived for thousands of years, before eventually spreading southward into the Americas. Over time, their descendants populated 2 continents from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. By around 15,000 years ago, human beings were present in most major regions of the planet, with only a few isolated islands and Antarctica still uninhabited. The most recent major human migrations across the open ocean were the Polynesian voyages, across the vast distances of the Pacific, beginning a few thousand years ago and continuing into the second millennium of the Common Era. Skilled navigators in double-hulled canoes traveled enormous distances using stars, currents, swells, cloud patterns, and the behavior of seabirds to find their way. Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, and many other islands were reached during these voyages. They are among the most recent of the major chapters of human exploration during the long arc of our species' spread. Throughout all of this expansion, our biology continued to change as humans moved into new environments. Natural selection acted on them differently in different places. Skin pigmentation varies across populations, in part because of the balance between protection from ultraviolet radiation and the need for sufficient vitamin D production through sunlight. In equatorial regions, darker skin protects against intense ultraviolet light. In higher latitudes, where sunlight is weaker for much of the year, lighter skin allows greater vitamin D synthesis. These differences are surface adaptations to local environments and do not reflect deeper biological divisions. All living humans remain a single, closely related species. In some populations, the ability to digest milk into adulthood evolved independently several times. Within the past 10,000 years or so, after the domestication of cattle and other dairy animals, this is called lactase persistence. Most mammals and most humans worldwide, historically, lose the ability to digest milk after weaning. But in pastoralist populations of Northern Europe, parts of Africa, and parts of the Middle East, mutations spread that allow the digestive enzyme lactase to remain active throughout life. Drinking fresh milk became possible. The adaptation appeared because it offered survival advantages in environments where dairy was a reliable food source. Around 12,000 years ago, in the fertile lands of the Middle East, something extraordinary began to occur. Small communities started planting wild grasses on purpose. They saved the best seeds. They tended the plants. They returned to the same fields. Over generations, the plants themselves changed. Wheat and barley became domesticated. Their seeds grew larger. Their stalks held the grain tightly instead of scattering it to the wind. The earliest farmers had begun the long transformation of the natural world into agricultural landscapes. This shift did not happen only in one place. Independently, in several different parts of the world, human communities domesticated their own crops. Rice was domesticated in southern China, millet farther north. Maize was domesticated in Mesoamerica from a wild grass called teosinte. Potatoes and quinoa were domesticated in the Andes. Sorghum and yams in different parts of Africa. Each region developed its own staple crops, its own techniques, its own agricultural rhythms. Domestication extended to animals as well. Dogs were the first. Their domestication probably began somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, from populations of wolves that lingered near human campsites and were gradually drawn into a partnership with people. Sheep and goats followed in the Middle East, roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago. Cattle came soon after. Pigs were domesticated in multiple regions. Horses came later, perhaps 6,000 years ago, in the grasslands of Central Asia. Chickens spread out of Southeast Asia. Cats moved from wild ancestors in the Near East into human granaries and then into human homes. Agriculture allowed populations to grow. Permanent settlements appeared. Villages turned into towns. Towns turned into cities. Pottery became common. Weaving, metalworking, mathematics, astronomy, and writing emerged in different regions in different forms across the following thousands of years. The first true writing systems appeared roughly 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and a little later in Egypt. The Bronze Age and the Iron Age unfolded across millennia, but these were only the most recent moments of an immensely long story. Beneath all of these changes, the biology of human beings continued evolving as well, though more subtly than in earlier eras. Brain size. After a long climb across hundreds of thousands of years, may have actually decreased slightly in the last 20,000 years. The cause is uncertain. Some have proposed that as human societies grew more complex, individual brain size could shrink slightly, while collective intelligence expanded through shared knowledge across communities. Some have suggested it may be a side effect of broader changes in body size or self-domestication. The full answer is not yet clear. The idea of self-domestication is a relatively recent line of thought in human evolution. It proposes that, much like other domesticated animals, human beings have grown gentler, less aggressive, more cooperative across evolutionary time. Modern humans have smaller jaws and teeth than their ancestors. They have flatter faces. They have a longer juvenile period. They show patterns of cooperation in childhood, unlike anything observed in other apes. Some researchers see in these patterns the same kind of changes that appear in domesticated wolves, foxes, and other animals selected for tameness across generations. Whether or not the term itself is the right one, the underlying observation remains striking. Humans cooperate at scales no other ape can match. Another distinctive feature of human anatomy is the visibility of the whites of our eyes. In most other primates, the sclera is darker, making it harder to tell where the animal is looking. In humans, the whites are exposed and high contrast. This makes the direction of our gaze easily readable. Babies, friends, and strangers can all instantly tell what we are looking at. The trait may have evolved to support cooperation, joint attention, and the sharing of information across small groups. The simple act of following another person's gaze, of pointing towards something, of looking together at a distant object, may be deeper in our nature than we usually realize. Long childhoods also distinguish us. Human infants are nearly helpless at birth. They cannot walk for many months. They cannot find their own food for years. They need to be carried, fed, taught, watched, and protected over much longer periods than in most other mammals. This long childhood may be linked to the need to develop the enormous and slow maturing brain. It also requires a remarkable level of cooperation among adults. In most other apes, mothers carry the burden of childcare almost entirely alone. In humans, fathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, siblings, and unrelated members of the community often contribute as well. This cooperative breeding pattern, sometimes connected to what researchers call the grandmother hypothesis, may have helped support the long human childhood, the late onset of reproduction, and the unusual presence of menopause in our species. Few mammals live long past reproductive age. Human grandmothers, by contrast, often live for decades after their last child, contributing knowledge, food, and care across generations. The human genome contains roughly 3 billion base pairs of DNA, organized into 23 pairs of chromosomes in most cells. It contains approximately 20,000 protein-coding genes. Only a tiny fraction of the genome differs from one person to another, but within that fraction lies all the variation that distinguishes individuals from each other, populations from each other, and our species from its closest relatives. Each new generation carries a fresh shuffling of these variants, recombined from parents, with a small handful of new mutations, passed onward into the future. Almost every cell in a human body carries a copy of this genome. Almost every breath, every heartbeat, every memory, every dream rests upon this slow inheritance shaped across millions of years. Our hands, which can grip a stone tool or thread a needle. Our eyes, which can recognize a friend across a crowd, or watch a star tremble at the horizon. Our voices, which can carry words across a quiet room. Our minds, which can imagine times long past and times not yet arrived. All of these emerged slowly, gradually, in the quiet rhythm of generations passing one after another across the vast stretches of deep time. When we look at children today, sleeping under blankets in modern homes, it is easy to forget how strange the path was that led to them. Their grandparents inherited from older grandparents in long, unbroken chains. Each link in the chain was a person who survived long enough to have a child. Behind them stretched generations of farmers and herders. Before the farmers stretch hunters and gatherers. Before the hunters and gatherers stretch cave painters and tool makers. Before them stretch the wandering bands of early sapiens, crossing rivers and forests. Before them stretch the Neanderthals and Denisovans, whose blood still moves in many of our veins. Before them stretch Homo erectus, walking out of Africa under skies long since faded. Before them stretch Lucy and her relatives, walking upright across a green valley. Before them stretch the small forest creatures whose names we do not know, swinging through trees, sleeping in the curves of branches, dreaming whatever dreams ancestral animals dream. And throughout the long story, the rhythms of the natural world remained constant in their slow turning. The sun rose, the seasons changed. Rain fell across forests, snow gathered along ridges. Stars wheeled overhead. The moon rose and set countless times. Tides came and went. Ancestors of every kind slept beneath those skies, dreaming the dreams of their own species, then waking again to continue the long work of survival. Even today, the inheritance is everywhere. Our long childhoods, our cooperative communities, our tendency to gather around fires, even if those fires are now warm rooms with soft lamps. Our love of stories told in firelight. Our deep response to music. Our need for connection. Our hands, shaped by millions of years of use. Our minds, shaped by countless generations of problem solving, language, and cooperation. The whole of who we are emerged from a long, quiet process unfolding across more time than any single mind can fully imagine. And perhaps that is one of the gentlest realizations to carry into sleep, that the body resting now in darkness is the result of an immense chain of moments stretching backward to the very beginnings of life on earth. That every cell in this body once existed in some ancestral form, in oceans and forests and grasslands, long since changed beyond recognition. That every breath drawn now connects to the breath of countless ancestors. That every heartbeat is part of a rhythm passed gently down across deep time. There is also something quieting in remembering how small a portion of this story we ourselves occupy. The human lifetime is a brief flicker, a few decades within a 6 or 7 million year arc of becoming. Even all of recorded history covers only a few thousand years out of those millions. The pyramids of Egypt, ancient as they seem, are barely 4,500 years old. Older still are the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, perhaps 11,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture had fully taken hold. Yet, even Göbekli Tepe is recent compared to the cave paintings of Chauvet, and Chauvet is recent compared to the bone flutes of Central Europe, and those flutes are recent compared to the first Homo sapiens at Jebel Irhoud, and Jebel Irhoud is recent compared to the early stone tools of the Oldowan, and the Oldowan is recent compared to Lucy, and Lucy is recent compared to the moment our line first diverged from the line of chimpanzees. Each layer rests upon a deeper layer. Each generation rests upon countless earlier generations, like sediment slowly building in the bed of a calm river, like dust gathering quietly over time in the corners of forgotten rooms. And perhaps that is part of why looking at very old things often produces a feeling of calm. A hand axe pressed by hands that lived 1,000,000 years ago, a footprint hardened in volcanic ash, a small carving rounded by countless touches, a skull resting in a museum case beneath soft light. These objects ground us in the deep, slow time from which we emerged. They remind us that our own concerns, however large they feel within our own days, exist within a much larger arc of patient becoming. And as the night continues onward outside, the long story still continues to unfold. Children are being born in hospitals and homes around the world tonight. New cells are dividing within them. New genetic combinations are being shuffled together. New possibilities are forming. The story is not finished. It never finishes. It continues. generation after generation, slowly changing, slowly carrying our species forward into futures none of us can fully see. Far above, the same stars that watched Lucy and her companions still drift quietly across the night sky. The same moon still rises. The same patient gravity still pulls oceans into long, slow tides. The earth continues its quiet turning. The forests still grow and fall and grow again. The rivers continue toward the sea. The bones of long ago ancestors rest beneath layers of sediment in caves, valleys, and dry plateaus across continents. They sleep there still, undisturbed in most places, gently held by the slow weight of time. And inside us, somewhere beneath thought, the deep inheritance continues working. The long hands, the high domed skull, the upright spine, the capacity for language, the capacity for tears, the capacity for laughter, the capacity for compassion, the capacity to look upward at the stars and wonder where we came from. All of these are gifts left behind by ancestors who never knew us. Their inheritance is everywhere in us, in every breath we take, even in the breath of sleep. That grows slower now in the quiet of evening. And so, tonight, as the body settles into rest, perhaps the long story can become a kind of gentle blanket, layer upon layer of generations going back into deep time. The slow rise of ancestors across millions of years. The slow gathering of small adaptations into the form of a modern human. The slow, patient drift of the species across continents. The slow turning of stars overhead. The slow, soft falling of memory into dream. Far back, beyond the cities and the farms, beyond the caves and the firelight, beyond the migrations across the world, beyond the bones in the cave systems of Spain, beyond the footprints in the volcanic ash, beyond the green valley where Lucy walked, beyond the warm forests where ancient cousins climbed slow trees. The long story continues quietly, fading into the deeper silence of time before time. The first single cells drifting in early oceans. The slow chemistry of warm, shallow seas. The patient unfolding of life across billions of years. From there, every later moment slowly bloomed. And here, tonight, on a quiet pillow, in a quiet room, beneath a quiet sky, that long story continues in one of its softest forms. A body breathing slowly, a mind beginning to drift, thoughts loosening, senses softening, the world growing distant, the forests grow quieter, the firelight dims, the caves grow still, the ancient footprints fade beneath gentle dust, the stars continue their slow, patient drift, the river flows on toward the dark sea, the long story rests, the breath slows, the body settles, the day fades, the mind drifts, the story softens, the night deepens, stars, quiet, sleep.